Hi there, I'm Claire Palombo, and today we're going to be talking about the story of World War II's American inequality at the home front. So, firstly, let's talk about some of the problems at the home front. World War II started in 1939, but initially the United States wanted to stay out of the situation. However, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the US felt it had no choice but to join. Although World War II was not necessarily fought on American soil, this did not keep wartime problems away from the United States. The American people and government were hostile during this time and very afraid of a homeland attack. Injustices were occurring left and right against minorities. Some of the most problematic offenses include instances with the Jewish refugee crisis, African American civil rights, and ethnic Mexican agriculture workers. The American government and people treated minorities poorly because they feared for their jobs, livelihood, and their superiority. However, many minorities, on the other hand, felt that they deserved equal treatment because they fought in the war as well, and they never did anything to deserve a lack of equality. So, firstly, let's talk about the Jewish refugee crisis. This was caused by the Holocaust in Germany. Many Jews were fleeing to the US to avoid death and persecution, but a lot of Americans were unhappy about this, even putting out posters such as the one above from the Primary Documents PDF. This poster says, over a quarter million Jews are now coming to the United States to throw white American workers out of jobs. And this is a flyer reproduced from holdings at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library. This poster clearly is condemning Jews, saying that Jews have to be communists and that they want people to join their nearest anti-communist organization, clearly telling the Jews that they're not welcome in the country, despite them not being welcome in Germany either. However, despite that fact, 225,000 Jewish refugees were admitted into the United States between 1933 and 1945, fleeing Nazi persecution, according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Like I said earlier, not all Americans were welcome of these Jewish immigrants. Some Americans felt that the Jews were not their problem to deal with, they didn't want to mix cultures, and they found it frustrating that they took jobs away from white Americans. However, there was still an understanding that Germany was evil from photography propaganda that made other Americans feel sympathy towards the Jews for the persecution they experienced. This is a newspaper article talking about Jewish immigration pros and cons, and it's talking about whether or not they should increase the German Jewish immigration quota in the United States. Essentially, the tables were really mixed on this topic. Some people believed that there should be allowed Jewish immigrants and they didn't bother because they knew that they had nowhere else to go. But a lot of people, on the other hand, felt that they didn't want immigrants, especially Jewish people, in the country because they were afraid that it would bring problems with them. Next, we're going to talk about African American civil rights. During World War II, African Americans were allowed to fight in the war alongside white soldiers. However, they were unfortunately not treated the same. They suffered from lower wages and tougher jobs. Furthermore, African Americans on their home front dealt with violence and poor treatment. The American home front experienced issues with African American civil rights during World War II. This quote is from the Primary Documents PDF, specifically Lynching Goes Underground, January 1940, NAACP papers. The opposition will contend that the all-time low of 5 lynchings last year proves that lynching is no longer a problem, and therefore the anti-lynching bill is unnecessary, but this is far from the truth. Lynchings have gone underground, as the enclosed report will show, but even if that were the truth, only 5 lynchings last year, the lynching spirit is as alive as it has ever been. Just as long as a single lynching can take place in the United States and the perpetrators allowed only to go scot-free. So basically that quote is saying that even if there are a few lynchings, which there are not, there are many more at this time, then it's still ridiculous that someone could lynch someone who's done nothing wrong or something that's not been proven in court wrong, and the people who lynched the African American don't go to jail. Furthermore, African Americans were also in the Army, but they were still segregated until 1948. That is the year that the United States desegregated their military, according to PBS. This shows that African Americans spent the entire duration of World War II not only fighting the war, but also fighting for their civil rights. African Americans were allowed into non-service combat roles in the military during World War II, but they were not yet considered equal. They still received lower quality equipment, weapons, and supplies. However, many units still succeeded despite this inequality. This is an example of the African American civil rights movement and people who wanted the anti-lynching bill to be passed. The African American civil rights movement during World War II faced problems that included the anti-lynching bill and the anti-poll tax. Basically, the American government did not want to pass the anti-lynching bill because facts were falsified to make it look like lynching was no longer a problem, even though there were underground lynchings occurring, such as showed a few slides ago. Also, the American government claimed that lynching was a type of kidnapping, therefore a local offense that the federal government had no right to intervene in without a person crossing state lines, even though lynching is clearly not kidnapping but a form of violence. Many state governments simply approved of lynching in some circumstances as a form of punishment to Negroes. Furthermore, the American government wanted to keep African Americans from voting in the polls by requiring a tax many African Americans could not afford. This goes back into the idea that white Americans wanted to have superiority over African Americans, even though that's unjust and unfair. Lastly, we're going to talk about Mexican agricultural workers. So, at the start of World War II for the U.S., Mexican immigrants were brought in as part of the Bracero program to help with manual labor shortages. However, many Americans did not want Mexicans taking over their jobs after the war was over, but the Mexicans were settled, so a law was put into place making immigration without documents illegal in these instances. This quote from the Primary Documents PDF shows that the war was getting closer and closer to an end. The U.S. was starting to worry about how the Mexican immigrant policy would change with so many soldiers returning home needing jobs. Immigration restrictions on Mexican workers have been relaxed insofar as the United States is concerned. This is a quote from Senator Carl T. Hayden to Henry Fonford on 5/18/1943. As part of the Bracero program, they were paid 30 cents per hour, which was promised to Mexican agriculture workers entering the U.S. during World War II. Employers were also required to provide humane treatment of the immigrants under this act, according to the Bracero History Archive, although the humane treatment didn't always occur, and sometimes they were given inspections, unfair living conditions, and not enough food. Although the Bracero program was still successful in the terms of the United States government during World War II, it became a bit of a burden on the United States when the war was over. Laws had to be put in place to guarantee work for the American people, but the Bracero program wasn't officially closed until 1964. This image shows just one of the examples of how the Bracero program Mexican immigrants weren't treated fairly. This is them going through a routine inspection. They're all very tightly packed into one room with one person going through and inspecting their teeth. So you can see that that doesn't really look like clean or safe conditions. That's all I really wanted to talk about in this PowerPoint. I hope you guys feel like you learned a little bit about World War II problems at the home front in regards to immigration and minorities. Thank you guys so much for listening, and that's it.